Hey y'all, let's talk today about social norms. So first I will tell you, I don't know if I've talked about this at all, but when I conducted my dissertation, I was in partnership with the National Park Services. Part of my project was, and then my dissertation was kind of an offshoot of that, where I was looking at how we alleviate people getting too close to wildlife in national parks. My advisor, Dr. Katie Abrams, is continuing this work still today and doing a lot of great work in this area. So I would very much encourage you to go look that up. It's really important. It's an important piece of how humans are interacting with the environment and how that is affecting kind of our national parks and our ecosystem and things like that. So I definitely encourage you to go out there and take a look at some of that research. But to bring it back to today's topic on social norms, part of my dissertation then was about people getting too close to wildlife to take photos, in particular like selfies, this Instagram culture of taking photos in cool places. And we saw that a lot. I think in 2020, there were a lot of articles that came out about how busy national parks had gotten. There's a lot of things happening with that. Part of it is, yes, maybe this social media aspect. Part of it was when 2020 hit and pandemic, and people were looking for ways to still have vacation and travel and go see the world without staying in hotels or like going to resorts or things like that, crowded places. So people were coming up with other ways to travel. Another piece of that was the national parks themselves launched a campaign to get younger people to come into national parks because they were losing a lot of visitors. So it's this combination of a lot of things all kind of culminating, happening all at the same time that caused our national parks to become overcrowded. But all that is to say, part of my then dissertation was around social norms and how that impacts our behaviors, and specifically how that is potentially influencing the ways that we are interacting in national parks, how we're getting too close to wildlife, and it's creating kind of these dynamics in parks that are frankly just dangerous. So I want to talk just today. We can talk about my dissertation another time if we want to, but I just want to talk to you today about social norms and what those are and what that really means. So social norms, they play a very significant role in behavior theories and behavior research overall. Psychology, sociology, communication, and other disciplines really have all looked at the impacts of social norms on human behavior and really our decision making. So generally, humans carefully observe the world around them and model their behavior on the behavior of others. So this modeling of behavior is, I think it was Skinner psychology. That is like an old, research. Like that is a kind of basic fundamental thing about humans. So when we're not sure what to do in situations, we often look to others for guidance. Part of this stems from our innate sense of belonging. So as humans, we all need to feel a sense of belonging. So this feeling of like we fit in, we have a group, we belong, we have a community or, a tribe to belong to. That is, one, it's just right, like we want that sense of belonging. Part of that is just a survival mechanism, right? Like we can survive better as in small groups. There's a lot of research on this from anthropology on why we tend to form these communities, tribes, or groups. There's also research on this when we talk a lot about like in-group, out-group behavior. But I want to get back to kind of the norms and social norms. So the environment and those around us play a role in our decision making. Whether you like to admit it or not, we are really influenced by others. So in the research, social norms are defined in a few different ways. For this video, I'm going to define social norms as the influence of real or perceived audience on an individual's behavioral decisions. So I just want to point out that these are real or perceived. So the audience that it could be a real audience, right? It could be we're in a communication interaction with people, with a spouse, with friends, with coworkers, and that audience is really there, and we're perceiving or we're having that interaction. It can also be a perceived audience that we think is out there. So, right, I'm creating this video right now. I don't know you. I don't know who's watching this, but I'm perceiving that there's an audience out there, and kind of acting accordingly on what I think that audience might want or need. And that really influences our decisions. So there's one really well-tested theory that includes social norms. That is called the theory of planned behavior. And I'm going to just briefly kind of walk you through that quickly. So the theory predicts individuals' intention to perform a certain behavior. Intention mixed with our perceived control are really good predictors of actual behaviors. So our perceived control over that behavior, and then also the intent that we have to perform that behavior, is a really great predictor of how we will actually behave. So there are a few things that also will impact our intent to perform a behavior. So our attitude toward that behavior, our subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control, which I kind of mentioned earlier. So let me define just a few of these terms. So first, our attitude towards a behavior. So how do we feel about that behavior? Attitudes are malleable. They're powerful, but they can still change over time. So just to keep things clear, so we have got values, attitudes, and beliefs. Values tend to be set in stone. They're the core of who we are. It's a big piece of our identity. Attitudes are kind of next on the list. They are very powerful. They are often personality indicators, but they can change over time, typically over longer periods of time is how our attitudes change. They are often based on our life experiences. Then we have the beliefs, and these are the most transient. They are easier to shift. Okay, so our attitudes about behavior are an important predictor of our behavior. The second thing I mentioned were subjective norms. So subjective norms are the expectations that we think others have of us to perform certain behaviors. Okay, and then the third thing that I said were perceived behavioral control. We need to create a sense of self-efficacy or control over our own behavior before we can perform that behavior. We're not going to do something if we don't think we can, or we don't think we have control over that situation or that thing. Social norms are complex, and often in communication, in the literature, in academics, it's often ill-defined. But there are really three different types of norms in this field. We've already talked about subjective norms. There's also descriptive norms. Descriptive norms are behaviors that one believes their peers would perform themselves. So what are the things that our peers, that we think that they would do? So in a certain situation, how do we think others might react? And then the third one are injunctive norms. So these are behaviors that one believes their peers approve or disapprove of. So there are these three different norms, right? Subjective, descriptive, and injunctive. Injunctive norms are what we think our peers would approve or disapprove of. Descriptive norms are norms that we believe, or behaviors we believe our peers would perform themselves. And then our subjective norms are the expectations that we think others have of us to perform certain behaviors. So there's definitely a difference between those three things, right? All of these different types of norms can have influence on our behaviors. It's why influencer marketing is so powerful, because they are playing on these different types of norms on what is out there, what's cool, what's trendy, what are the things that we aspire to, right? So we often will turn to others to help guide our behavior, especially in situations when we're unsure of what to do. We turn to others on like, how do we behave in order to fit in order to feel like this sense of belonging, this innate sense of belonging that we have. We look to others, and those are really the social norms of our communities. And with technology, our communities have grown into these large, right? It could be anywhere. People all over the world are starting to influence, how we behave, which is a very interesting dynamic coming from originally these small tribes of people. And we turn to those within our own communities or tribes to help dictate our behavior. And that made a lot of sense because we had to keep that tribe or community in order to survive. Now, with this kind of growth of technology and connection and all these things, it's made things a little bit more complicated in that sense. But I'm kind of digressing here a little bit, and I just wanted to kind of walk you through the different kinds of social norms that are out there, and we can talk later about how that kind of impacts our behavior, and how we can, one, use that to our advantage, and two, just be aware of these different norms and when we should kind of fight back on them and when we shouldn't, when we should lean into those.